Hey guys, so at the beginning of this semester, we talked about how the task of logic was kind of twofold. On the one hand, it was concerned with understanding reality, right? And on the other hand, it's concerned with evaluating arguments about reality. And those two things are not mutually exclusive, they go hand in hand. But so far, we haven't been able to talk about argument yet because we had to do all this preliminary work. Because as you're going to see, understanding what an argument is requires you to have an understanding of a couple more basic concepts. But you guys have some of the basic concepts, so today's going to be the next step. So the question for today is, very straightforwardly, what is an argument? So I'm going to give you a basic explanation, definition, whatever you want to call it, and then we're going to talk about a couple of key terms within that definition so that it all makes sense. So an argument, first and foremost, we can say is a set of claims containing both a conclusion and at least one premise. All right, so an argument is a set of claims containing a conclusion and at least one premise. So the key terms here are claims, set, conclusion, and premise. So you already know a little bit about these things. So in previous lessons, we spent a lot of time explaining what a claim even is. And so what was a claim? If you remember, a claim was any utterance with a truth value, or any claim capable of being true or false, any statement or utterance rather, capable of being true or false, right? So you have that down, and now you know that arguments involve claims in some sense. Now, what do you think is the significance of this word set? What does it mean to have a set of something? Well, it means multiple, more than one. So you know, based on this definition, that an argument cannot be just one claim. There needs to be at least two, whatever this thing is, and at least one of whatever this thing is. Why is that the case? All right, well, look at an example. Let's say I say to you, Pink Floyd is a better band all around than Led Zeppelin. Is that an argument? And if you think about it, you would say, no. And I would say, okay, well, why isn't it an argument? And the answer is because I'm not giving you any reasons why, right? I'm not actually going into detail as to the justification for that claim, right? And that's precisely why you need more than one claim, because you need to say something, but then you need something to support that something. So you need at least two claims. That's why we say it's a set. So if I said, Pink Floyd's music is a lot more moving than Led Zeppelin's. Pink Floyd used a greater number of studio techniques that were innovative at the time, and Pink Floyd's music is more technically complex in terms of, like time signatures or something like that. And then I said, for those reasons, Pink Floyd is a better band than Led Zeppelin. That's an argument, right? Because you have a bunch of claims working together in this kind of support structure. And that's where these guys come in. Conclusion and premise. So what is a conclusion? A conclusion is kind of your main claim or your main point, right? The thing that's trying to be proved. Another way of describing it is to say that it is that towards which the rest of the argument points. So in the example I just used, the conclusion would be Pink Floyd is an all-around better band than Led Zeppelin. And a premise, on the other hand, you can think of these guys as the support claims or the reasons or the pieces of evidence, right? They're the things that point towards the conclusion, the things that hold up the conclusion, in other words. And you need both of those things in order to have an argument. And there's a couple different ways you can determine whether something in a passage is a conclusion or something is a premise. So let me write an example up here that I think will be helpful. So let's say the most basic argument that you're always going to find in any of your philosophy classes looks something like this. You say, all humans are mortal. Okay? And then you say, usually the next line is, Socrates is human. But to make it easier, I'll use myself, right? So I'll say, Professor Seeley is human. So what would follow from these two claims, right? So if humans are mortal, if all humans are mortal, that's the key, right? All. And if I am a human, it would necessarily follow that, therefore, I am mortal. Right? So this is an argument. And if I were to ask you to identify what the premises and conclusions are, I mean, well, it's written out nicely here, so you're able to see. And by the way, this is something called standard form, which you're going to have to be familiar with when you do assignments, right? So an argument in standard form is one where the premises are written out on separate lines, and then you have a line, and then the conclusion. So it's kind of like a math problem. But the question is, how do you know this is the conclusion and these are the premises? So the best way, which is the longer way, is to do this thing I call the why test. And so let's say you had all of these sentences arranged in a passage and they weren't breaking up nicely for you. So you're just reading these three sentences and someone said, what is the conclusion? The way you know something is a conclusion is because if when you look at it and ask the question why, the other claims should make sense as reasons why. If when you ask why, the other claims make sense as reasons, then you know you've correctly identified the conclusion. But if you ask why and the other claims don't make sense as reasons, or they don't provide sufficient reason or something like that, you know it's not the conclusion. So you say, oh, maybe this claim, Professor Seeley is mortal, is the conclusion. Why? Well, because all humans are mortal and he is a human. All right, makes sense. But what would happen if you didn't choose that and you said something like, oh, maybe Professor Seeley is human, is the conclusion. Well, let's see if the other sentences make sense. Well, all humans are mortal and Professor Seeley is immortal. Does that prove that I am a human? No, that doesn't make sense because it's not saying all mortals are human, right? So that's not good. So you know that's not the conclusion. And let's say you say, oh, maybe all humans are the mortal. Sounds like the conclusion, right? Because it's like very big and definitive. You said, okay, well, let's test that out. Does it make sense to say, oh, you know that all humans are mortal because Professor Seeley is a human and Professor Seeley is mortal? Doesn't make sense. Does not make sense. So the why test is probably the best way you can determine what the conclusion is, right? What is the thing towards which all the other claims are pointing? That's the conclusion. But there's another way you can figure this out, and these are kind of like a shortcut. And they're not bad, because they work. But you shouldn't only rely on these things, and I'll explain why in a second. So there are these things called indicator words. So you have conclusion indicators and premise indicators. And these are words or phrases that, point out that what's about to happen is a conclusion, or what's about to happen is a premise. And so think about it. What do you think some common conclusion indicators are? And I used one before, I think. The most basic one that maybe comes to your mind is therefore, right? Therefore is a pretty solid, I'm not going to say pretty, is a solid conclusion indicator. Whenever you see the word therefore, you know the thing to which the therefore refers is the conclusion, right? All humans are mortal. Professor Seeley is human, therefore Professor Seeley is mortal, right? And then all the other words are basically just synonyms of therefore. So you have, for example, thus, you have consequently, you have some longer words like for this reason, right? Or for these reasons, or for those reasons. You have other ones like, as a result of that, right? Because as a result of that, it's telling you, like, because of those things, this thing now follows. So that's a good conclusion indicator. Here's one, hence, right? Just these synonyms of like therefore and thus. And there are other ones you could think of, but this is a good starting point, I think, to get your head in the game. So, all right, what might premise indicators be? Well, here's an easy one. Because. Right? Why? Well, because blah, blah, blah. That's a premise. Right? Most of the time, that's going to work. The only thing that complicates these things are like when you have a long sentence with dependent clauses. So you can be like, because blah, 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 comma, conclusion. So like that might be confusing because you have the sentence starting with because and ending with the conclusion. But you have to think specifically about the clause that the indicator word refers to or like is functioning within. That's going to help you sort things out. Or since is another premise indicator. What else? How about for the reason that, and notice how that's distinct from this, right? For this one is saying, for the reason that was just mentioned, here's the conclusion and it follows, right? Whereas this is saying, for some particular reason, space, it follows that, and the space is where the premise would go in here, right? So any indicators like because, since, or for the reason that blank, right? Anything like that is going to put your head in the game. And I go over some more of these on the PowerPoint, so always keep this stuff in mind. These are good. When you see these, they're going to give you like a shortcut. However, do not rely on these. One, because they're not always going to be there. And two, because they're slightly, I'm not going to say less definitive, but can present themselves in a way that confuses you, such that what you come up with is less definitive than if you use the Y test, for example. So, an argument is a set of claims containing a conclusion and at least one premise. You know what a claim is. You know that there's the S in claim, so it's a set. You know at a base level what a conclusion is. You know at a base level what a premise is. And you know that when you line up arguments, you do so in standard form. And here are some indicator words. But as I kind of alluded to before, your things aren't going to be set up cleanly for you. What you're going to have to do, like 90% of the time in class and in life all the time, because you're never in a formal logic class in life, is you're going to have to like read stuff or listen to a speech and extract the argument from it and put it into standard form. And that's going to require you to be able to identify the conclusion, identify the premises, and arrange those in a way where you accurately represent the argument that's unfolding behind the passage. Okay, so if you look at slide 7 and after of the PowerPoint, you're going to see some examples here that might be helpful. So take a look at this passage. It says, killing innocent animals for pleasure rather than necessity is unethical. In today's world, people can obtain their nutritional requirements without killing animals. Therefore, eating meat in today's world is unethical. All right, so think about what the conclusion is and which claims serve as premises. So think A of the why test and B in terms of indicator words. And if you do that, you'll come up with something like this, that the last sentence is the conclusion, right? The therefore eating meat is unethical, whereas the other two claims, the ones in yellow, are the premises. And you could know this by performing the why test, right? Eating meat is unethical. Why? Well, because killing innocent animals for pleasure rather than necessity is unethical, which is the first sentence, and because people can gain all of their nutritional requirements without animals, which is the second sentence, right? So that why test, that chain of reasoning makes sense, right? It wouldn't make sense. So let's say you said, oh, killing innocent animals for pleasure rather than necessity is unethical is the conclusion. If you said why, it wouldn't make sense to say, oh, because eating meat is unethical, right? Like, because eating meat is unethical does not support the claim that killing animals for pleasure is unethical, right? Like, that doesn't make sense. You're just, what would you say? Like begging the question. You're just repeating the same thing. Or if you said, oh, in today's world, people can get all of their nutritional requirements without killing animals. That's the conclusion. Why? Oh, well, because killing innocent animals for pleasure rather than necessity is unethical. Doesn't make sense as a reason. It doesn't work, right? But you also know because there's those indicators. There's a therefore, so it's a dead giveaway. Okay, let's look at another example. Something you might see happen in the political sphere or the religious sphere. So, since life begins at conception, abortion is tantamount to murder. Think about what the conclusion is and what the premises are, right? What's the main point that the other thing is pointing at, so to speak? Well, the second half. And this is an interesting case because here you see that a claim is not synonymous with a sentence, because this sentence, for example, contains two claims, right? Because one sentence can contain multiple utterances capable of being true or false, right? So a clause can be a claim. And why do we know that this is the conclusion? Well, because if you say abortion is tantamount to murder, why? Well, because life begins at conception. That makes sense as a reason, right? Why the person would say that. But then it wouldn't make sense the other way around. Like if you said, oh, the conclusion is life begins at conception. Why? Well, because abortion is tantamount to murder. That doesn't make sense, right? The reasoning is backwards. And here there's another indicator word, since, right? So you know life begins at conception is the premise. And here's an example, by the way, of what I was saying where you don't want to rely on indicator words in a way that's incomplete, because A, it might make you think this is one claim, and B, as a result of that, you might think that the stuff after the comma is still part of the premise. But remember, I said that you could start with an indicator word, but then the clauses do some weird thing so that it's not completely straightforward. So you always want to know what clause the indicator word refers to, because that's going to tell you whether it is a conclusion or a premise. But remember, the indicator words are not always going to be there, so make sure you remember that why test. And here's an example of that. So the passage says, music companies that primarily focus on tangible media are more likely to go out of business than those companies who don't. Digital downloads exceed purchases of physical CDs by 300%, and people prefer not having to rip through the endless layers of plastic associated with physical CDs. This is tough, but this is more like something you'll encounter, where there's no hints, right? There's no easy way out. So look at that and try and think what the conclusion is, right? What is the main point? And then what's supporting that main point? Well, here's what you'll come up with. The conclusion is music companies that primarily focus on tangible media are more likely to go out of business than those companies who don't. Why? Well, because digital downloads exceed the purchases of CDs by 300%. That's one claim. And, so you know there's a second claim, people prefer not having to rip through the endless layers of plastic associated with physical CDs. Right? It wouldn't make sense if you spun it any way around. And this is also important to note that the conclusion can happen anywhere. Like sometimes it's the first sentence, sometimes it's the last sentence, sometimes it could be in the middle of the passage. We don't know. That's why you want to make sure you're familiar with all of these principles. So that's basically it, guys. You should have a basic understanding of what an argument is, what the components of an argument are, how to look for those components, and you now know some examples of those components and of arguments as a whole. So hopefully you feel good. If not, that's fine. As always, please feel free to reach out via email or office hours. I'll see you around.